we're going to give it maybe just another minute for some more to join us before we get started. Couple minutes after 3, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our session on making youth apprenticeships equitable and effective. We're going to learn a little bit about what worked in North Carolina. My name is Lisa Chensvold, and I am the Communications and Marketing Director at the National Fund for Workforce Solutions. And so some of you on this webinar probably already know us, but I just wanted to say a little bit. I'm not going to take a lot of time on this for those of you who don't know who we are. You can see what drives us and what we are, what we're working on here at the National Fund. We really take a multi-pronged approach so that workers, employers, and communities really are thriving, and we see workforce as a way to get there. Can you go to the next slide, please? So you can see, I'm going to explain a little bit. This is really how we operationalize our mission. We invest in a network, a nationwide network that's about 32 or so communities, all united by our values, which you see there in the middle ring, one of which is racial equity and inclusion. That is central and something that we want to infuse throughout our work. And we leverage this network to pursue these 5 integrated solutions of activating employers to invest in their workforce and make their jobs better, and ensuring that our workers are equipped for success, and addressing changes that systems that need changing or that are getting in the way of those successes when necessary. And we leverage investment at the local level and the national level to provide these communities with the resources they need to do the work. And so apprenticeship really touches a lot of these solutions. A lot of times multiple systems got to get involved and make some changes. Certainly we're equipping workers, employers have to make that investment. And we're hoping to do that in a way that provides equitable opportunities for more workers. So we're excited for this presentation today. On the next slide, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about kind of our co-convener and a supporter here. I don't know if you know about the Partnership to Advance Youth Apprenticeship. It's an initiative of New America. And the National Fund is one of 8 national partners in this partnership. This is really a multi-year collaborative effort, really trying to understand what high quality apprenticeship looks like in America, intensify learning across these partnerships and across their networks, and gain more support for more of these apprenticeship in America. So we'd like to acknowledge them and thank them. And next slide, please. So we've got 3 speakers today. I'm really just going to make introductions here and then do a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'm going to turn it over. But we've got Allan Freyer, who's one of the authors of this NC Justice Center report, as well as Pam Howze, who will be our moderator today. Pam was our Director of Work-Based Learning when she worked on this report. And we have one of their supporters at the state level in North Carolina at ApprenticeshipNC, Elizabeth Standafer. So we are excited to bring these on board. I'm going to turn it over to Pam in just a second, but we have a couple of housekeeping pieces to cover first. You can see what we're going to talk about here. You'll learn about their study and their findings, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. And speaking of, here's our speakers again. You already saw that. Speaking of Q&A, so you all are muted. We'd like you to send your questions as you have them and in the designated question and answer time in the chat box. And Pam will moderate that conversation using the questions that are presented in the chat box. So it's we encourage your fingers to do the asking here. And there's some instructions for you about how to access the chat. Should be an easy to find chat icon, and we welcome your questions. If you're having some sort of technical issue and need some emergency help, there's your contact there. Josh can help you out. So with that out of the way, I am going to turn it over to Pam, who I'm very excited to hear from today. So Pam, take it away.
Thanks, Lisa. So just a couple of facts about what prompted the study, which was funded by the Annie Casey Foundation. So, you know, Allan and Elizabeth and I have been working together a number of years, and one of the things that we find is that young adults often have a higher unemployment rate than other people. And so we see these kids who really don't have any direction right out of high school. They don't know what they're going to do. They end up taking a dead-end job, and then they're kind of stuck. And so, you know, it's really been curious to watch this whole youth apprenticeship initiative and how that initiative is really changing the face of employment for young people. Next slide. And one of the things that's really fascinating is that people of color also have a higher than average unemployment rate. And so one of the things I want to mention is, you know, I was involved with the Guilford Apprenticeship Partners before I went to the National Fund, before they ever had apprentices. And so really watching them evolve into offering these career opportunities to young people of color was really fascinating to me. And so Allan and I decided to work together on this study to really try to uncover some of the ways that they had diversified their apprenticeship population. Next slide. And so Allan was approached by the Annie E. Casey Foundation about this project. They had been aware of the Guilford Apprenticeship Partners. They had actually been to North Carolina to visit with the group. And so when Allan approached me to help participate in the study, I said, this is the group we really need to look at, because I've seen significant growth in their racial equity and inclusion over the past 5 years. And I think we need to uncover what they're doing that's really important. Next slide. And the purpose of our study was really identify what gets in the way to getting these young people into programs. It was pretty fascinating, actually, to identify some of those barriers, not only to completion, but for people to actually get into a program. And we wanted to publish something that would help other programs learn about what North Carolina was doing well, specifically the Guilford Apprenticeship Partners through what we call the Eastern Triad Workforce Initiative, and that is a national fund site here in North Carolina. And we wanted to really have some takeaways for people to use to strategize about how they overcome those obstacle barriers into getting young people into the apprenticeship programs. Next slide. So we really looked at 4 counties in the Piedmont Triad region. The Eastern Triad Workforce Initiative is what we call them at the National Fund for our collaborative. This particular 4-county area started out focusing specifically on advanced manufacturing. They have now delved into several other sectors along the way. You can look them up online, the Guilford Apprenticeship Partners. They'll look at all the companies that are participating, all the sectors that they're now working in. And we spent a significant amount of time identifying and interviewing people who were workforce stakeholders, teachers of these students at the particular high schools, their career development counselors, those sorts of folks. And then we actually had 3 focus groups, students who were already apprentices in 2 area high schools. And so we really were keen on getting stakeholder feedback so that we could really put together a robust report that would tell the whole story of the Eastern Triad Workforce Initiative. Next slide.
Hey, Pam, we have
Yes.
a request that people are having trouble hearing you, and I'm not sure if it's your speaking end, but if maybe you could speak a little bit louder and we will monitor and see if people can hear you better.
All right, I'll get closer. And so one of the things that we looked at is types of barriers. Is that better, Lisa?
I don't know. I'm monitoring the chat box, so I will see.
Okay.
I can hear you okay, but some others are not.
Okay. And so we were looking at really design barriers, missing or broken stages of the pipeline. We discovered some of those along the way. Also really some functional barriers. So when students have circumstances that prevent them from getting to work or getting to school, you know, that becomes problematic for some of these young people of color. And so we really looked at some ways to identify wraparound services that would help them along the way. And our companies in this particular initiative have done an excellent job of really working with their students to ensure their success. Next slide. And so who are the actors and where are the interactions? So, you know, I think all of you know that parents can be a problem for some students because they have their own paradigm about what an apprenticeship is and what advanced manufacturing environments are like. High schools certainly have paradigms because they're kind of forcing everybody down the one way to be successful is to go away to a 4-year university or college. Now, employers typically hire people who look like them, and so that can be problematic. Then also community colleges can also be another interaction for the student along the way that could either make or break their success in a program as rigorous as apprenticeship. And so, you know, we see that apprentices really experience barriers from their interactions with all of these particular people. And then how do we educate the actors so that the interactions are favorable and positive and help the students get into this, you know, sustainable workforce development program so that they can succeed. And so Allan's going to talk to you about our findings and sort of the way that we went about conducting the study. So Allan, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Pam. This is Allan Freyer, and I apologize. I'm still getting over a rather nasty chest cold, and my voice is not 100% back. So if you can't hear me, I guess just say so in the chat box, and I'll try to raise my voice a little bit. I also want to give a shout out to Dr. Allison Forbes from the Center for Regional Economic Competitiveness. She was a co-author on this report and conducted a lot of the direct interviews. So this really was a team effort, and we're excited to sort of present the specific barriers that we found across each of the interactions that Pam just mentioned. You can go to the next slide. So broadly speaking, Pam mentioned that there are 2 different barriers. One is about the design of the pipeline, and all too often in other examples across the country, other models, we found critical gaps in the pipeline, like maybe the community college wasn't at the table, maybe there wasn't a pre-apprenticeship and there was only an apprenticeship, or there were no employers involved in designing the program. The good news, at least for the Triad and what they got right, is that they really built and designed a pipeline that really worked for everyone. And I think the proof, one of the sort of the highlight quotes of the proof of this came from an African-American apprentice we met in one of the focus groups we conducted in the high school. He said that, you know, higher education is not for us, meaning African-American men. It was never for us. It's always a rigged game. But GAP is different. It works for us. And so one of the things that this just struck us, that the program was designed in such a way that folks who historically felt like the entire higher education system was not even intended for them was working so well that they felt like they belonged. So I think that speaks to the overall design and the ways in which the partners work together. You can go to the next slide. So on the design level, the Triad program got a lot right. There was deep employer engagement and leadership from the beginning. and they had all the right players at the table. The college system was there, the school system was there, employers were there. The workforce board in some of the counties was present and active. And this allowed a well-funded administrative infrastructure to develop that used a strong intermediary. A local community foundation in Guilford County, the Greater Greensboro Community Foundation, serves as the administrative anchor. They were able to secure state and philanthropic dollars to help administer the program, keep the trains running on time, convene the right people, hold the meeting, set the agendas, all that stuff. They were also able to disperse the funds that were crucial for actually operating the program in each of the individual counties. So an additional piece that, that Pam actually was instrumental in passing to the General Assembly was a tuition waiver. This program involves, the full apprenticeship is a 4-year program, but it involves the completion of a 2-year associate's degree in a relevant occupational field. And all too often, cost can either be a barrier to participation among students or among employers who are asked to pick up the tuition tab. But in this case, we have a state-funded tuition waiver that allows the state to pay for each student's associate degree program in community college if they're an apprentice. And then what we also saw was constant adaptation, particularly among the employers, to overcome barriers as those arise. And we'll talk about what some of those specific barriers were, but every time I give this, I really try to highlight the extent to which this is creative, dynamic, and innovative. And these employers were doing everything they could to reduce the problems that students were experiencing as they came up. You can go to the next slide. Now, as with every program, there are design features that can be improved. At the beginning of the process of standing up the program, the employers did a wonderful job of engaging with the school system by inviting the school system staff to attend meetings and be involved in the discussions. But when it came to actually engaging individual high schools, we found that there was really just a patchwork approach, and that they were only able to get to some schools and not others. And that meant that some students never even heard about the apprenticeship opportunity. Now, some of this is just inherent to what happens when you start up. In a large urban school district, it's very, very hard to hit every single school. And so it's not surprising this was the case, and we saw significant improvement over time. By the most recent year, so 4 years after start, in the most recent year, in 2019, every high school was visited by employers, every high school received marketing materials, and they also used some of the funds that were raised to provide robocalls to every junior and senior in the system so that they would hear about the program. So along with the patchwork engagement, we did see some what we say is inconsistent intentionality in engaging students of color in the high schools. And what that meant is that in some high schools, we saw recognition among the career counseling staff that they had to go take some extra steps in order to engage students of color. And we'll talk about what some of those are in a little bit. But they recognized that there were barriers to students of color hearing about and participating in the program, and they needed to be intentional about bringing those folks in. But that was inconsistent across the schools. There was not a common paradigm for how career counselors or principals or faculty could engage and bring in students of color who might otherwise feel like this was something they could do. So that, can you go back? The last piece of this is that it sort of ties into lack of representation from communities of color who could vouch for the program as students and parents. I said earlier that every single relevant partner was invited to the table, and that's true. What we found, however, was that folks with credibility in communities of color weren't invited or didn't come to the early planning meetings. And so that meant there was some disconnect in the communities that the program most needed to reach, but that would otherwise be most skeptical. You can go to the next slide. Now, functional barriers are, so we talked about design barriers. Functional barriers are really the circumstances in a student's life that, when it combines and interacts with the program and the realities of trying to go to high school, go to community college, and go to work, really become real barriers to the ability for students to complete, particularly folks of color and low-income populations. And so when we thought about how we should sort of structure this, we recognized that as Pam said, that there were 4 major actors that really influenced and filtered the student's experience. And when you're 17 and 18 and 19, your parents and your social networks are often one of the biggest filters. So what we found was that across the board and among white communities and communities of color, there was a strong preference for 4-year college options that hindered the acceptance or view of apprenticeship as a possible career and possible life. Now, what we found, however, was that the skepticism of a non-4-year option was particularly heightened among communities of color. In the counties that we were in, there is a legacy, particularly in the white community, of manufacturing and technical occupations. And so there was some familiarity with it, even if 4-year college was seen as the preferable option. But in communities of color, what we saw consistently was that parents felt like the 4-year option was the only path to middle-class sustainability. And so there was a higher level of skepticism that the program has to overcome if they want to recruit more students of color. Part of that involves lack of early exposure. The literature and best practices across the field suggest that students need to be engaged as early as 8th grade in order to persuade them that technical occupations are a real thing, that are a viable career path for them. And so we found in the triad where we studied that there was just a lack of this early exposure, and it really did hinder the employers and then the career counselors when they would try to overcome parental skepticism of the apprenticeship option. What we also heard specifically in communities of color were 2 additional pieces that didn't necessarily show up when we talked to white students. The first is that there was a really real feeling that social networks in communities of color didn't include employers and didn't include manufacturers in particular. Whereas we had one focus group, for example, where a number of students who had considered apprenticeship but did not participate were explaining why. And a couple of them said, "Oh, my uncle runs a welding business. I'm just going to go work with him." Or, you know, my dad runs my dad is a senior manager at a plant. I'm going to go work there. And that those types of connections didn't show up when we were talking with the students of color about their own communities. So a second fear that we heard, not from the students, but we heard from really from faculty and program staff, were that they were concerned that parents would view career and technical education and apprenticeship and career pathways as another form of discriminatory tracking. Unfortunately, North Carolina, like many places, has a long history of segregated educational pathways where students of color would be pushed into certain less lucrative occupations while white students were allowed to go to the pathways that were more financially viable. And so when we talked to students, we didn't hear from them that they felt that was a concern. But what we heard from the program staff and the faculty was that they were concerned that such a thing could happen, which I actually thought was really good because it demonstrated that there was real intentionality in how they developed the program and intentionality in terms of how they were thinking about how they could engage the students. So next slide. So what we also found, and this is not surprising, we found that insufficient income to provide transportation, equipment, course supplies served as a barrier for low-income students, and particularly students of color from low-income communities, from being able to participate in the program. This, however, and this is no surprise. I mean, I think we all hear transportation when we're out in the field talking to folks, that lack of transportation is a barrier. But what we found here that was really encouraging is that the employers noticed right away that this was a problem. And so what they did is that they set up a fund, basically, that would allow them to pay for whether it was gas cards or Uber cards or safety equipment like steel-toed boots, that they were able to meet that need among the students themselves, which is an encouraging example of adaptation. What we also found is that, particularly again for folks on from lower income families, In order to enter the apprenticeship program, you have to go to an open house, meet the employers, and your one parent or guardian has to come too. But what we found is that parents, particularly in low-income communities, they work multiple jobs and they're already juggling multiple responsibilities that made it harder for them to attend the open houses. But so that's a real barrier. But what we found, again, an example of adaptation is that there were examples of where, like, the career counselors went in place of a parent with the student so that they could attend. So while this is a barrier, we also see real efforts to try to make sure that this wouldn't hinder students who are interested and able and willing to go. What we also heard is that there were examples of where parents expected their apprentice students to work multiple jobs during the apprenticeship, largely because that income was being used to support their entire family. And so you had examples of where the parents were expecting these apprentices to work 2-3 jobs on top of finishing high school, going to community college, and being on the shop floor with their apprenticeship. And there were a couple examples of where students had to pull out because they weren't able to sort of meet that full range of expectations. And then lastly, we found that lack of work authorization documentation among parents was also an issue. This is a part of the state where there is significant controversy around immigration status, where the local law enforcement doesn't necessarily have a positive relationship with communities of color and immigrant communities in particular. And so lack of work authorization documentation hindered students' willingness to put their name out there because they were concerned that authorities would then look into their family. You can go to the next slide. So if high school students if their worlds are largely shaped by their parents, we know they're also deeply shaped by the high schools in which they attend, and that really serve as the main feeders into our youth apprenticeship programs. If the high school doesn't engage enough students or intentionally engage students or push certain students away, we know that we won't have enough apprentices, or we know that people who could be apprentices will not otherwise be able to do them. So we looked at the barriers that face students in high school, and we found that in certain cases, the high schools didn't engage students early enough to raise awareness, so that they were just learning about the program in their junior year or just when they were about to graduate. And then they had to go argue with their parents about whether they want to do this or go to college, go to four-year college. And so again, just reflecting on that best practice about engaging people in 8th grade, as early as 8th grade, we just found that schools needed to engage the students early in order to get enough folks into the program, or to make sho that everyone who would be interested and suitable for it would do it. And that ties into the second piece, which is high schools fail to engage enough students. This can happen, particularly when it's connected to implicit bias in the exposure and the recruitment stages. When CTE faculty or the career counseling staff choose to engage some students and not others, implicit bias just pops up when they're thinking, students in a career and technical education look a certain way. They probably look like me. They probably look like everyone else I've ever associated with this, which often just means usually white folks. And so we found that implicit bias really did filter out students of color unnecessarily. Related to that was sort of how students saw that filtering process happening. We had focus groups where we had African-American students in particular say things like, before I really learned about apprenticeship, I just didn't think it was for Black folks. I just thought it was, I thought it was for white folks. It was things that white people did, because their parents are employers, their parents worked in manufacturing. I just didn't think it was something for me. And sort of the way in which those students were engaged required a journey from overcoming that particular type of skepticism. And that's just something we need to pay attention to. And that's related to the last piece, which we call the representation recruitment challenge, but that we found it was just really essential. And this is backed up by, I think, a lot of research in other areas. but that it's really helpful for a person of color to see that apprenticeship is for them. They need to see other apprentices and other employers who look like them. So apprentices and employers and alumni who are people of color. And that when they didn't see that, that made it harder for them to learn about and want to participate in an apprenticeship program. Go to the next slide. Sort of getting down really into the nitty gritty. We did these focus groups in the high schools, and we got some really fine-grained information from it. One of the things we found is that career counseling can be difficult to difficult to access, particularly in large schools with significant wealth disparities. What we learned from the focus group process was that low-income students and students of color who were in predominantly white schools didn't, particularly ones where there were a lot of wealthy people, if they were not wealthy themselves, they saw career counseling as something that was not for them. And that if they did try to access it, they carried a special burden of representing what they articulated as was sort of the burden of having to represent all the stereotypes that are often placed upon people of color, but also representing those people in their community every time they go into the counseling office. So there was this much heavier emotional baggage that they had to carry even when they were trying to access the counselors who were the gatekeepers to recruitment into apprenticeship. We also found that, another barrier resulted from where you had different marketing across different schools. We heard examples of where some high schools got extremely detailed materials, got presentations, got a full court press, and then others just got a flyer. And my sense is that has changed over time. I mentioned before that there was sort of in that patchwork approach, but that improved over time as the program engaged the high schools more consistently. We also heard that materials were insufficiently detailed and lacked racial diversity. And again, while I think the particularly progress on the racial diversity in the materials is real, we heard consistently from current apprentices and folks who were learning about and entering the program and applying for it that they didn't really even know what an apprenticeship was, despite all the marketing that they had received, didn't really understand what it meant on a day-to-day basis until they started the program. And they said that actually did scare away some of their friends. So it just speaks to the importance of making sure that the marketing materials are appropriately detailed. And then lastly, we heard this, it's a common refrain among employers broadly, but insufficient preparation and soft skills at the high school level. We heard examples of where employers would meet with students either during the open houses or during the interview process when they were trying to make decisions, and that a lot of the apprentices didn't have they didn't know how to do interviews, things like that. And while I tend to believe that that there is often a tight tie between soft skills and implicit bias, and that some of the concerns over soft skills are a little overblown, I will say that we heard consistently stories of where if the high school had been more intentional in working with apprenticeship applicants on soft skills, that there was a sense that those applicants did better in entering the program, being selected into the program. And there was a fun story of a time when an African-American apprentice went back to his high school and helped 4 or 5 of his buddies fill out their applications to make sure that they would fill out their applications, prepare for the interviews, do the things that you need to do to get ready for a job interview. And that really made a difference for those friends' applications. So next slide. So the next sort of interaction students face in the apprenticeship journey is their interaction with their employers. And there are a lot of barriers that can result from this particular experience. First off, students may, at the whole beginning of the process, they may never even encounter an employer who introduces a career technical education or even says that an apprenticeship is possible. And this is where early exposure is so important. If you don't have it, if they never had this encounter, they may pursue a 4-year education, or they may, choose a non-technical path when the apprenticeship really could have worked for them. So that encounter and that exposure to employers is crucial. Now, related to that is, and again, this idea of a patchwork approach, but a barrier can result when employers visit some schools and not others, and then when they're in the schools, engage some classes, but not others. And part of this is because we recognize that within the schools, there is still implicit bias over what types of students are recruited into career and technical education, those that are not, and that those can interact in ways that make it hard for students of color to be at the right meeting, to hear about this opportunity, when otherwise it could really, really work for them. So what this means is that students may never encounter employers or apprentices that look like them, employers or apprentices of color. And this is where we said that it was really crucial to provide, whether it's alumni or employers or plant managers of color, to be the ones to carry the messages into the school, to carry the marketing materials, to participate in the presentations, to engage the students of color that allows them to say, oh, this is something I could do. The last piece, on the slide, is that all too often overly strict criteria can screen out qualified applicants. And what we heard consistently was that there were concerns that that a hard and fast minimum GPA could create problems and barriers, and that the grade point average itself reflects sort of upstream implicit biases that don't make it an accurate measure of a student's aptitude for this program. So you could have someone who would be right on the edge. Maybe your program requires, for some of y'all out there, you know, maybe your program says you have to have a 2.8 to get in, and there's someone who has a 2.75. If you're too tightly screened, if there are no exceptions, and that person who may be a great fit loses out because of 0.05%. And so what we saw in our case here is that employers were aware of that and really worked hard to be flexible with the grade point average. For folks who were right on the bubble, who would be a great fit, but maybe they didn't quite meet the threshold. I will say, at the same time, that is balanced with the community college system's a basic requirement that you have to have a 2 point. Elizabeth will correct me when I'm wrong, when I say this wrong. I think it's a 2.8 in order to not participate in remedial classes, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. But there is in order to participate in this program in North Carolina, you have to be able to meet the minimum threshold for college admissions, and that does screen out otherwise qualified people. You can go to the next slide. So when we think about sort of the end result, we want employers to hire students. And so what we find is that a very real barrier is that there are just not enough employers to place all the interested students. And it's particularly true among employers of color. And that's when we just, again, recognize that students in communities of color are more likely to be able to see themselves as participating as an apprentice if they see someone who is, or if they see an employer, they see the ultimate end in their career, they could own the business. If they don't see those types of figures, then they're more likely to not pursue the option. So recruitment of employers is really important. The next piece is that what we heard, particularly from the core employers who had been working with the program and helped start it, worked with it for years, they said that when they brought in new business owners, the newer employers were more likely to rely on preconceived ideas of soft skills and fit. And this, I put fit in quotes, largely because we know that, particularly, you know, when we're talking about the South, when we know that implicit bias, racial biases are real, the concern is that newer employers who hadn't sort of been acculturated to the new program model would just want folks who look like them. A good fit means someone who looks like me, you know, drives the same kind of truck, likes to hunt, likes to fish. This is rural North Carolina that we're talking about here. And then it's important to be able to shape their conceptions to say soft skills and readiness can look different ways. And that fit, belonging to your company, can have a more expansive definition if we're intentional and careful about what it looks like. And that really does feed into that next point, which is that the research shows that employers are more likely to hire students who look and behave like them. And that can be a barrier to to folks in communities of color who don't fit that description. Lastly, we found that lack of documentation for immigrant students served as a barrier. We heard of one particular heartbreaking example, really, where a dreamer didn't know that she was a dreamer. She thought she was a citizen, brought her social security card to the community college, had made it all the way through the program, and was getting ready to register for classes when she discovered that her social security card had been forged, and that she was not a U.S. citizen and couldn't participate in the program, and didn't otherwise have a temporary protected status or had a work documentation that would allow her to participate. So that could be whether it's a forged social security number or a related concern around those who do have protective status, do have work authorization documentation. Some of those students then could face out-of-state tuition costs. And we had an example of that where, again, these really adaptive, innovative employers, they just figured out that they could pay the difference between the out-of-state tuition and the in-state tuition, and they made it work for that student. But if we're talking about a system that would be broadly open and accessible to students from immigrant communities, a one-off employer trying to fix that by themselves is like trying to put a plug in a dam. And so that presented a real challenge that many of you may face in your communities. Go to the next slide. So the last sort of experience or interaction that students have is with the community college. I touched on the GPA requirements. This is where we found that students who came in with too low of a GPA, even if it was a minimum that qualified for the program, it still triggered the remedial education requirements, and it forced these students to take classes. Remedial classes that were outside what their cohort was doing, and it really damaged the cohort model that the program was trying to foster, where they'd all go to the same classes, they'd all go to work, and it really built this esprit de corps that was really crucial for completion. I mentioned tuition costs for DACA students. I think lastly, what I would say is the most relevant piece here is that we did hear a lot about scheduling alignment issues with community college classes for certain career and technical education tracks and students. So we heard sort of examples of where students were trying to go from high school to the college, but the schedules didn't line up right, and they had to go to work, and it was a challenge. So just to the extent that other programs can reduce those alignment issues and make it seamless would be really useful. You can go to the next slide. So just, we said before that the program was very successful in maintaining people in the program and moving them to completion. I mentioned how employers really tried to work with their students. They're required to be supportive of the classroom time. They created these special financial funds to support students when they needed equipment and transportation and things like that. They even provided financial education classes. So they really tried to address these functional barriers as they arose. So what that meant is that there was actually a pretty good retention rate across the entire cohorts. Now, what we see in this slide is basically when you get everyone who applies, what happens? They need to attend orientation, then they get invited to pre-apprenticeship, then they get invited to the pre-apprenticeship, and then ultimately they participate and then they complete. If you can go to the next slide. So one of the things we had to figure out was, you see that red box with the question mark. You have all these applicants and only 83% of them attend orientation, which is still a pretty high number. What happened to that group of folks? And that's where we heard everything from students, parents can't come, I didn't have transportation, or, maybe I didn't really want to do this after all. And it's a relatively small number, which shows that I think the selection process is doing a good job. You can go to the next slide. So lastly, you have the biggest drop in attendance or participation is between students attending orientation and those actually invited. And it is a 30% drop. And this is where students are screened out. This is where employers can't find the types of apprentices that they want. And that's where we heard about the barriers around soft skills, around sort of employers finding the people that they want, this thing called fit. But once all of that is addressed, you actually see really, really high participation rates, which shows that the wraparound supports that the program is providing is really doing a good job. When you have, yeah, so I think I'll just leave it at that for the sake of time, but we were impressed with the level of retention given the stringent screening and admissions requirements. You can go to the next slide. Okay. So I'm going to go through this really quickly. You can go to the next slide. So we learned all this stuff, and now we want other folks to be able to apply some of the things we learned. So the most important piece really is for intermediaries or program administrators. It's that employers need to lead, and they need to fund, and they need to pay attention and monitor what's going on. Alongside that is that it's really crucial to provide funding in administrative capacity. This is making sure that there is a convener, that they have the staff time to call the meeting, invite the people, have the tough conversations. And then at the same time, that there is sufficient funding for the overall program to support a tuition waiver. We found that was the free college piece was one of the most important contributors to student participation and success. Lastly, it's making sure that all partners are at the table, including trusted voices and communities of color who can really vouch for the program with otherwise skeptical parents and students. And part of that is a systematic and intentional engagement in the high schools among students of color. And we recommend creating a common training curriculum for the high school career counselors to do that work. And then you need to adapt to student needs as they arise, and that's the wraparound supports that I mentioned. Okay, next. You can go to the next one. Okay, so you really need to develop a systematic high school engagement plan to reduce gaps from a patchwork approach. And then make sure that marketing is layered, hits everyone who needs to be hit, and explains apprenticeship sooner, as early as 8th grade, in much more detail. You can do the next one. So for the community college, the piece that we would push here is really around making sure there's a close alignment between the occupational degree, the career pathways that get you to the degree and then build beyond that degree with the high school CTE program and the needs of the employers and the apprenticeship program. And lastly, protect that tuition waiver. It really is the heart of the program. You can go to the next slide. Okay. That's all for me. Pam, if you want to.
Sure. So you heard Lisa talk a little bit at the beginning of the webinar about the partnership to advance youth apprenticeship. You'll see on this slide here that we've developed some national principles and definitions for what a high quality apprenticeship should look like. The National Fund remains a national partner with PIA, and I remain as a TA consultant for the project. PIA actually awarded 12 grants this year to a variety of states and regions. We actually thought that we would have maybe 35, 40 applications. We had more than 200 from states in every territory, some states with multiple applications. So we decided on 12 grantees, and all of those grantees had a racial equity component in their application. So is working really hard to secure some additional funding for some years to follow on. There are other funders that are really interested in this particular thing. And so we're hopeful that there will be continuation funding and we'll be able to continue the project for another round of funding for additional grantees. Next slide. And these are just some principles. You know that apprenticeships need to, of course, be career oriented, but a huge part of that, and that every student has an opportunity to participate in these apprenticeship programs, that they actually get credentials and college credit that helps them along the way, that they are designed collaboratively, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. And students, employers, and program outcomes are monitored. And so one of the things we really found in this project, and I think Allan and Elizabeth would agree, is that the employers actually went out of their way to support these students of color and to help them along the way and to help them overcome the barriers that were put in the way of those particular apprenticeships. Next slide. And so you can see principles and outcomes. I'm not going to read them to you, but one of the requirements for the PIA grantees was that they had to have an equity component. Particular grant application. One of the ones that is most memorable to me is one out of Oakland, California. It's a high school that has a very high immigrant population. They also have a high population of single mothers in high school there. And so they've developed a youth apprenticeship program around child care providers where the students actually earn certifications in child care across the state of California. And they actually have a child care facility there at the high school in Oakland. So really showing an example of how they really built the equity component into their particular youth apprenticeship program.
Hey Pam, we're having a little trouble hearing you again. Your line seems a little bit unstable, so anything you can do would be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. So before we go to questions, I know we had an inquiry about two things. One of them was the model that is being used in the Eastern Triad Workforce Initiative. This is a high school to youth apprenticeship model, but it's a collection of employers who are working together to actually recruit and place these apprentices as a collaborative effort. So really showing the power of collective impact in their recruiting processes. So the employers are actually doing the recruiting themselves at the local area high schools, and they're kind of dividing and conquering. And so when Allan talked about the fact that it was kind of a scattered approach, these employers are kind of doing this as a off the side of their desk job, right? So they're typically HR or operations people who continue to do this work along with the partnership. So the other piece was a question about the North Carolina tuition waiver. The state passed a waiver about 5 years ago that made community college tuition free for any high school to youth apprenticeship program for the life of the apprenticeship. So if I'm in high school and I go into a registered pre-apprenticeship or apprenticeship program, my community college tuition for the remainder of my apprenticeship program will be funded by the state of North Carolina. And so with that said, I invite you to ask some questions. And it looks like the chat box is filling up. Kelly Aiken is asking if we can promote the GAP case study. We actually did write a case study on this particular movement in North Carolina that can be found on the National Fund website at nationalfund.org. On the initiatives tab, you go to apprenticeship resources, and that case study sits on that website. How can you become involved with the other employers that are working with the high schools? I'm just getting started. Elizabeth, could you take that one?
Sure, thanks, Pam. Employer engagement in terms of bringing companies together is really a grassroots industry-led effort here in North Carolina. So creating a consortium of like industry partners who have similar pain points in their companies is often facilitated by workforce development boards here. Sometimes the idea comes from a school district who reaches out to a partner like the Community Foundation of Greater Greensboro, who then convenes those partners. Sometimes it's the industry partner that goes to entities. It's really just important to do resource mapping in your local area to determine who the players are and who are conveners or intermediaries that can help synergize a conversation.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So we have another question. How did the North Carolina state policy come about to support the tuition waiver? Who led that charge? So I would say that I was at the Department of Commerce at the time leading the state's apprenticeship work. We had employers who were asking questions about what could the state do to help support them. So we rallied around our legislature with the Workforce Oversight Committee. We found a champion on that committee who actually proposed the bill to implement that tuition waiver, and that bill was passed. And so we think that's a real nugget that we have in North Carolina that a lot of other states do not And so I would just say work with your elected officials in the state to really educate them about youth apprenticeship, and then start talking about ways to really incentivize your employers across your state to implement something like that.
Pam, can I add to that?
Sure.
So along with the tuition waiver, one of the key funding pieces to making the program work that we studied was a special appropriation that the Community Foundation got from the General Assembly. And that appropriation, I think was $12.5 million. And I think in this year's budget, it's like 19 million. I may be getting, Elizabeth, you can probably speak to the specific numbers, but there's a significant enough amount of money in the local area to really provide the administrative backbone the intermediary needed to do the work it's supposed to do as an intermediary. But it was a small enough budget item where it didn't raise an eyebrow with our appropriators on the relevant committee. So it is that another, along with the tuition waiver, if you're building a regional program, you know, we of course would advocate for the state to invest enough money in these programs, offices like Elizabeth's Apprenticeship North Carolina. But if you're running a regional program, pursuing a special funding earmark could be useful for supporting your intermediary. It can be a good solution.
So one last question here. What have employers done to address the lack of documentation issue, if at all? What are the options for undocumented and immigrant youth? And unfortunately, the employers cannot legally hire these young people as apprentices, so it can become quite problematic. You heard Allan tell the example of the young lady who didn't even know that she was undocumented. So, you know, depending on their documentation can really impact their community college tuition amounts, or whether they can even go to community college or even be employed in the U.S. So this is still a problematic area that we know about, and we're hoping that that's going to get resolved over time. Yes, these are registered with the Department of Labor. North Carolina is a state approving agency, so we have our own agency that documents these apprentices and reports them upstream to the U.S. DOL. Our Guilford Apprenticeship Partners employers think there's no other way than registered apprenticeship, but we do have other models across the country where the employers are not so adamant about that. So our philosophy is if it meets the needs of the employer, it's really up to the employer whether they want to register or not. Yes, the slides will be made available for all of the attendees that signed up. So I think Josh, we have a little email here. You'll have an email to an email from the National Fund to everyone who signed up, and that will include the webinar recording and the slide deck. And I'm also guessing that Josh will put this on the webinar series, the apprenticeship resource page as well, where we've captured about 6 other webinars. So I want to thank all of you today for joining. Please know that we are available to answer questions along the way. If you would like that, or if you would like some assistance from us about how you do this work, I think we've gotten really good at it in North Carolina. You want to close us out?
Thank you so much, everybody, for your, to Allan and Elizabeth, who we heard a little bit from, and to Pam. Thank you so much. Looks like this generated a lot of conversation. We will follow up with the slides, as we said, and once we've got that GAP case study online on our website, we will also follow up with attendees with the direct link so you can read that case study. So thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to our speakers, and we hope to see you on another webinar sometime soon.